Welcome to the Lit Lounge, everybody. Hello, people who are in the room with us. Hello, people in the future. Thank you so much for being here with us. My name is Jodi-Ann. I'm a speaker, I'm a writer. I work at the intersections of race, culture, and health equity. I want to first thank the Lit Lounge sponsor and co-creator oneKIN. So if you don't know about oneKIN, it's a mission-driven retail company that works to help small businesses and creators. So definitely check out their marketplace. You can get candles, cosmetics, jewelry, all from BIPOC-owned small businesses. And you can find the book that we're going to talk about today, The Loneliness Files by Athena Dixon. And you can shop the entire Lit Lounge book list collection at shoponekin.co. So without further ado, I'm so excited. I've been waiting for this for a long time. So excited to be in conversation with Athena Dixon, who is the author of The Loneliness Files, a memoir and essays. Thank you so much, Athena, for being here, and welcome to the Lit Lounge.
Thank you so much. I was trying to wait for the siren to go by. Hello, thank you for having me.
Listen, this is a part of the lounge, right? You cannot control your environment. Like people come in and out. It's city noise. So I appreciate the city being a part of our conversation today. So I want to start talking about this book with a confession. I started reading your book. I pre-ordered it last year. I started reading it. I got 2 or 3 chapters in. I would text you every time I finish a chapter. And I don't know if you remember me not texting you anymore.
Now that I think about it, yes, but no, it did not register in my brain that you stopped talking about it.
This book is so vulnerable. It is so beautiful. It is such an invitation to meditate on my own loneliness. And I could not take it. It was like a lot for me because I had to confront like my own stuff, you know?
Yeah.
And so I want to thank you for that experience because I took a breath for a couple of weeks and went back into it and just found a whole other way of understanding loneliness, seeing myself in relationship to my family, my friends, my romantic interests, confronting being away from home. I'm representing Queens today, which is something that you explore in the book. So I just wanted to at least start with that confession.
It's okay. I accept that confession.
But I did finish it and I read it twice. So could you please just tell everyone who's watching, if you haven't been able to read this incredible work yet, could you tell us a little bit about the book?
So the book is a collection of essays, which is really like a memoir and essays. And the vast majority of it was written between March of 2020 and April of 2022. So I spent the vast majority of the original COVID lockdowns in my apartment by myself. And so I started to write about how loneliness manifested in my life. And it started off kind of like the basic level. But what the book turned into was an exploration of all the ways that loneliness has showed up in my life over the course of my entire adulthood, really, and even some of my childhood as well. And so the book really looks at all the ways that happens, through being a divorced, middle-aged, childless woman, to digital isolation, to being isolated and writing fan fiction, being isolated in grief, and actual physical loneliness. And so the book came to be this exploration of all of those things with no real expectation of solution or resolution at the end of it.
Yeah, no, and I felt that, but I did feel there were a couple of moments in the book where there wasn't a resolution, but more so of an invitation to kind of answer these questions on your own, which is, I think, why I started to stop reading it, like why it started taking a longer time to kind of get through the essays, because I'm writing in the margins, I'm asking myself questions, I'm answering your questions, and it became a really interactive experience, which is interesting because it's a memoir, it's your story.
Yeah.
So how did you think through like the tone and the balancing of like, this is me, this is my story, and I know it's going to be publicly consumed and be doing something, right, for whoever is going to be reading it?
I think first, the balance of myself and kind of the research elements and the pop culture elements and kind of the external elements came because I started off with those first. I used a lot of outside stories and a lot of research as almost like a narrative distance with myself because, like you mentioned earlier, writing this book was like the first time I really, really, really had to confront my loneliness. I'd always had school or work or relationship or duties as a sister or a daughter or as a friend and all this busy work that existed around my life. So the things that I knew I was feeling, I didn't have to really confront. And so I used a lot of outside sources as a way to still hide. And then by the time I got to the latter half of the book, I was like, oh no, I can't hide anymore. And so the balance really was really, really external at the front. And me kind of cycling down to this micro level view of myself. But I will honestly say that I didn't think I was writing the book to start. So I didn't have to think about it. Like that first opening essay, Say You Will Remember Me, was going to be a standalone. Like I was just like, this is a weird story. And I feel like I could die in this apartment and nobody would know. I'm going to write it. But then I was like, but this is not the first time you felt this way. So start to write about it. Start to figure out if other things like this exist in the world. Start to figure out how over the course of a bare minimum the last 15 years you felt this way. And so that's where kind of the personal balance came in. But it really started as me creating narrative distance for myself. So I really fully didn't have to confront it to start.
Yes. So I want to pick up that first essay because that really got me. It's about Joyce Carol Vincent. Can you tell us about Joyce Carol Vincent and what brought you to her story and how the circumstances of her death impacted you and this collection?
So Joyce Carol Vincent was a British woman. She was of Gen X. She was at the earlier part of Gen X. I'm at the tail end of Gen X, like a zennial in a way. And she was everything you're supposed to be. She was educated. She was upwardly mobile. She had passions and interests outside of her job. She was very well connected. She was dating. She was engaged. And then for reasons that are still unclear, she kind of disappeared. Right. She moved into this, what they call a bed sit, like pretty much a studio, 1-bedroom apartment above a mall in London. And she just disappeared for 3 years. And so she passed away in 2003. And they found her body in front of the television, which was still on in 2006. She had Christmas gifts around her, and they weren't quite sure what happened to her, but nobody realized she was gone. She scared me a lot. She scared me a lot because I could see myself as her. So like I live here in Philadelphia, which is about 400 miles from my family and my friends. I live in this apartment by myself. I have no partner, no pets, no children. It's just me. And I came across her story because of the algorithm, actually. I got really, really lonely during that first wave of like really that first like 6 to 8 months were like the hardest for me. And I started watching video game walkthroughs on YouTube to have like human voices in the background of my day because I went from being in an office 5 days a week to just me in this apartment. And the algorithm on YouTube started showing me like these mystery videos and deaths of people. So I started watching lots of videos about Kanika Jenkins, who was a young Black woman who was found in a freezer in a hotel in Chicago. And they were trying to figure out how she ended up there during this hotel party. And eventually Joyce's story came up and I watched a video about it and I was just like, this could be me. And I got to figure out how I got here. And I still haven't fully figured out how I got here, but that's how Joyce came to be. It was really the algorithm and then that fear that drove me to start writing about her.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think at the time that I read that essay, I went for a run. I live near a lake. And so I went for a run around the lake. And on that run around the lake, and I learned this later, but I witnessed a water rescue happen. There's like all these fire trucks and stuff. And I was asking about it. It turns out that there was someone in the water, someone who was also on the path like me, saw someone struggling in the water. And it turned out that that person had drowned and died. And I was there running and did not even notice that there was someone in the water, probably as I was running by, who was struggling. And so I'm like, I can't tell you how many times I go out onto that lake on my own. I go to that
Mhm.
lake all the time, on the lake, around the lake. How long would it take for someone, a stranger, because that person
Yeah.
wasn't with anyone, a stranger, to notice that they were gone? How long would it take for someone to notice that I was gone? And so the
Mhm.
fact that she was there and had passed away 3 years without anyone noticing her, that also scared me. And
Yeah.
it was like different layers of fear, right?
Mhm.
And I think the question, when I looked at my own life, of like, how did we get here?
Mhm.
Well, how can you really, I really think like maybe like 6 weeks could go by before someone noticed, right?
Yeah.
How did that happen? It brought me to this sense of like, do people think that folks who are lonely are that isolated or that selfish? Because what
Mhm.
struck me with Joyce is that she was surrounded by Christmas gifts that she would have given to somebody, right?
Right. She had sisters.
Yeah.
It's like I can't imagine. Like me and my sister live almost 400 miles from each other, but I can't imagine. Like I talk to my sister in some capacity every single day, and I can't imagine even from 400 miles away that she would just be like, "Yeah, my sister's not picking up the phone or answering the FaceTime or answering the text message." At some point, now it might
Yeah.
take a week or two before they show up on my doorstep, but they're coming, and I think it's really sad because I feel like one of the things that scared me with her, besides the possibility that I could physically die alone and I would be here for however length of time before somebody found me, was the fear that in the choices that I've made in my life by moving to Philadelphia, by isolating myself in order to prove things to myself that I really no longer need to prove, like in that setup that I've created among my family and friends, like would they at some point say, well, maybe she's just going through something and we'll just let her be.
Mm,
But I really need you. But because I've set up all these steps leading up to this moment in my life, I'm not going to need you when I really need you. Or you're not going to be there because I've told you, oh, I just need to move 7, 8, 9 hours away because I
yeah.
need to do something. I'm like, and it's sad because I can only imagine maybe the reason those Christmas gifts were there was because she was about to make an effort
Mm,
again, and she never got to because time had run out. I'm like, and I don't want time to ever run out because I'm here doing whatever I'm doing and creating this very isolated and solo life when it's not really necessary.
yeah, that's so real. I can't tell you how many times in your book I wrote, should I move back to New York? Should I move back to New York? Should I move? What I find fascinating about the Christmas gift image is that it sets up this contradiction of our assumptions of loneliness, right?
Mhm.
um she was connected at, or at least intended maybe on making those connections, right? But without those gifts, maybe we would have had a different narrative about who she was and what was going on at
Mhm.
the time. And so I'm curious if in your exploration of loneliness, did you find other contradictions of like what we expect or what loneliness looks like and what the actual experience of loneliness is?
I actually had somebody ask me at one of the book tour stops about it was a little bit of an aggressive question, but she asked me like, how can you essentially expect people who are reading your book to understand that you're lonely when you clearly have people who love you? And I had to explain them like loneliness isn't the absence of love. It isn't the absence of connection. It's an internal thing. And I know, like, I wrote a whole book about loneliness, and I have a mom and a dad and a sister that I talk to every day. But there is something internally in me that no matter how deeply I love and am loved in return, there is a buffer. There is
Mm,
a veil that exists. I'm still trying to figure out why it exists, but I think that our concept in society of loneliness is this character flaw. I think that we think that people who are lonely and people who are isolated, there's something fundamentally wrong with them because humans are meant to be social beings. Humans are meant to connect to each other. And if you're feeling lonely, that means there's something that you're not doing or some defect in you that you have to fix in order to be a member of society. I'm like, no, there's just some people that singularity is just both a comfort zone and a trap. And I think that one of the saving graces of the last couple of years, outside of COVID, obviously, is that it made a lot of people who felt like they weren't lonely have to confront the fact that they really were. And I think it's starting to change how society is looking at what loneliness is, because when you strip everything away and you don't have to worry about the busy work, like you may very much identify with people you thought were the weird loners. Like they're just more open with their feelings. So I think that people think that it's a defect. And I think it really a personality trait that for me, through writing the book, I had to figure out what parts of the loneliness were useful for me and what parts of it were like, all right, you're doing a lot right now. You need to go connect with some people. Because I know that there is a part of me that's like, I could make the effort to be friendly, but I'm not.
Yeah.
So I think that's what it is.
I think loneliness as a personality, like part of a personality, but I think also loneliness as a rational response to your environment, because that makes me think of Geneva Chambers, right?
Yeah.
She's an older woman. So I think there's a connection with age too. Well, she's old and she's mean. So of course she's isolated. But you don't know what she went through, right? That could be the way that she was trying to protect herself from what we know to exist in the public. You know what I'm saying?
I mean, and that's how I ended up in Philadelphia. It really was a reaction to like the worst period of my life. And I was like, okay, now that I'm no longer a wife and I feel like I'm not the best daughter or sister or friend, like all these roles that I've inhabited my entire life, once they're stripped away and I'm down at like rock bottom, I have no idea who I am. I have no idea what I want. I've lived this perfect, like good girl life my entire life and thought that there was like this pot of like American dream at the end of the road, and it was not. And so I moved here purposely to isolate myself. I said there was no plan. I moved here with no apartment. I moved here with one paycheck and like a car full of stuff. And I had to figure out when I got here who I was. And so I needed to isolate. I needed to find a way to pretend like the world didn't exist. And that was really a trauma response. It really was me being so hurt and so heartbroken that I was like, there's no other choice. I can't go back to where I was before. So my option is to pretend like the world doesn't exist, build myself back up. And then when I feel like I'm sufficiently strong, then I can reconnect. And I think that's kind of probably what happened with Geneva Chambers. I wish that I could have found more information on her. I had to stop myself because I was like, a half a second from ordering the police reports from Florida. I was like, you're doing too much at this point. Please stop. But I really wish that there would have been more information because I really do feel that her age, the fact that it doesn't mention that she had children. I didn't see any articles that said any family or friends came forward to like talk about her or claim her or to clean up her name. Like, I think she really was a singular being in the world. And the fact that they all just like, there's articles about you dying and being in your bed for 3 years before they found you. And the whole article's about how you were mean and you yelled at kids. Like there was nobody to like attempt to understand her. And that was like those first 3 essays in the book between Joyce, Geneva, and Elisa. I wanted to kind of put some kind of humanity back to them because I think they all got they turned into like these urban legends of sorts. And I wanted them to have humanity because we don't know what drove all 3 of them to do the things that they did other than the salacious details that we get after their deaths.
Yeah, it's interesting because those first 3 essays I'd circled in my table of contents, and I've been calling them like the headline essays, right? Like people who had these very public lonely deaths where like the worst thing that has ever happened to you is what people know, and that kind of divorces you from like your personhood. And something about that is connected to some thinking I've been doing around Breonna Taylor and the ways that her name and her murder became like an internet meme. And she just like was not a whole person. And the efforts that people have been putting to just bring some humanity back to her, like Ta-Nehisi Coates had published that conversation with her mom, and you learn that her mom were really into muscle cars and motorcycles, you know?
And it's almost like in her case, it's very much like, yes, what started off as a way to make sure she was not forgotten, to make sure that she was given some modicum of justice, turned into her not being the person that we were trying to lift up in the first place. But I think that part of that too, on a broader spectrum, is just like when I wrote in that Elisa Lam essay, Ghost in the Machine, is that like at some point you become like just a handful of bullet points. You become talking points. You become a hot take, and all humanity is lost. And I think we do each other such a disservice, like in our quest to understand, we reduce people to almost like these scientific social experiments, and we forget the base level is the human behind it.
That's real. Yeah, that essay, I mean, you explore this a little bit of having like a final death and a digital death.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's a lag between the two, because the specific circumstances with Elisa is that her Tumblr was just still going.
Mm-hmm.
Like literally a ghost in the machine.
Yeah. Still going.
It reminded me of, like, I don't know if you ever seen on Instagram or LinkedIn and stuff where the family members of people who have died are posting as them to like let people know what happened. Have you ever seen that?
I've seen like people make announcements, but like actually posting like as in the voice of the person who passed.
Sorry, not in their voice, but to say like, "Hey, no, that's creepy." Like posting on their accounts.
Yeah, I've seen
say,
that.
"Hey, I'm the family member.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a message that they wanted to share, or this is what happened." And there's something always so eerie about that, because we know that there are bots all over social media.
Yeah.
But then when we see that there are people, we're assuming that they're just existing and fine. But at the same time, we know that that's a caricature of their lives,
Mm-hmm.
right? So to see that disrupted in some way with like a death announcement or something like that, I don't know. It's just such a
I
don't know.
Like I have a cousin who passed, and a couple of weeks ago in my like Facebook notifications, it popped up as like, it's his birthday. And I'm like, I had forgotten that his page was like still there. And then morbid curiosity made me click on it. And it's like the same thing as like people saying happy birthday. And then as you look through the rest of the post for the year, people like coming on and say, oh, so-and-so happened today. Almost like, I know I can't speak to you, so I'm going to speak to you through this digital version that I know can never respond. It's almost like people who keep voicemails, because you want to make sure you don't forget somebody's voice. I know that that's one thing that I've struggled with a lot, is the further and further away I've isolated myself from certain people, not necessarily my intimate family, but like people who were important in my life before. One of the things that really, really messed with me was forgetting the sound of their voices and realizing like how easily it can just be erased from your brain if you're not in constant contact, because there's so much noise and expectation of connection in the world that like the things that are important like that, you lose.
Yeah. I think that sonic connection to our loved ones and people that we know is really important. And I think the memories we have with them too can have these sonic relationships. Like, I don't know if you're ever listening to a song and you're like, oh my God, I remember being on the bus and talking to this person or having this conversation. And, so like people's voice being like the soundtrack of their memories, and then having like actual music be the soundtrack of that relationship.
That's a really good line. Their voice is being the soundtrack of their memories. That's a good line.
Is she a writer?
Hey, write that down before I'm like, hey, by the way, I need that.
No, you can have it.
It's like that's one of the ways I fundamentally knew that I had kind of healed from certain things, was I would be so obsessively listen to certain songs because it would take me back to a certain place. And when I could like the song would come on and I would forget that it was on, I was like, oh, you're good. Because it didn't like break you, it didn't stop the world.
Yeah.
Or people whose voices I didn't forget. Hearing their voices didn't make me crumble. I was like, okay, I'm good now.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm gonna write that line down before I forget.
It'll be on YouTube. You can watch it. So speaking of music, it was really generous for you to give playlists in different sections of your book. And I felt it as a way of like, to be kept company, almost like a book about loneliness and then being accompanied by this music. So if you could talk to me about the music, like how does music impact your writing? How did you choose those songs? And what are you hoping that the music does for the reader in their experience with your work?
So music is like, as a writer, it's interesting. I'm going to say music is probably the most important thing in my life. Even though I'm a writer, I grew up with a dad who was a DJ outside of his day job. And so my entire life in some way, shape, or form revolves around music. And so I write in complete silence, but because I read aloud as I write, but I set the table for me to write by listening to music, have playlists for everything, individual essays, individual characters, for fiction stuff that I write. And so there is a playlist for this book and the last book. I think this playlist is like 4 or 5 hours long. And so I guess I should say, originally every essay had a song. And there was like a lead in to the essay with like a song lyric, but then rights are a thing. So
rights are a thing.
And then I also had to be cognizant of the fact that I couldn't keep breaking up the flow of the book by putting a song lyric every essay. It was just kind of destroying the flow of the book. So those 3 songs per part were like the songs that I thought that best set like a sonic landscape for what came after them. And so like for part 2, when I talk about being in the float chamber, I didn't want somebody to come in and like, I'm not trying to handhold readers, but also I think writing, especially memoir, is a multimedia experience. So I didn't want readers to come into an essay about me being isolated in a float tank in the silence and in the dark and listen to something crazy. So like, I want you to listen to Ravina, a song that has like no lyrics, but it makes you feel like you're floating. So I wanted to kind of set like an emotional and sonic landscape for each section. And so when we get like to the last section, Kendrick Lamar's Think of Me, I'm Dying of Thirst. A lot of the stuff in that last section is about death and grieving, and there's death and grieving in that song. So those are ways that I could like reach out to my readers by saying, hey, this is what I was listening to in some places when I was writing this, but also this is going to help you get into an emotional space before you read these particular pieces. And that's what I really kind of wanted to lay out there, was just to find a way to envelop readers both sonically and on the page.
Yeah. Speaking of float, I did that float thing once.
Mm-hmm.
And for people who don't know, you can be in like a Epsom salt bath. There's this kind of egg-like chamber, a sensory deprivation tank. I did it once and I never did it again, because for some of the reasons that you talked about, and feel free to share that. But I realized that I was escaping the internet,
Mm-hmm.
but I felt like my world is already so quiet as a single person who lives alone, studio apartment, in a place where I don't have a lot of family, or any family, just a couple of friends here and there, that I couldn't actually distinguish between the self in the sensory deprivation tank, because I felt like my life was already so deprived of connection.
Yeah. So
it was too depressing. I was like, I'm not coming back here.
I will say that I was obsessed with them to the point where I got like a monthly subscription to them and took another person with me. Like, this is great. You have to go. I will say I've done it multiple times. I started off doing 90 minutes. So essentially, if you've never been in one, you have this tank of water. They have different sizes. Like the most common one is the one that looks like an egg. And it's filled with like 200 and some odd pounds of Epsom salt and water. And the water is like the same temperature as your skin. So you're not hot, you're not cold. You just feel like you're floating. And you can do them with clothes. You can do them without clothes. You can do it with light, with music. But I did mine from the very first time, 90 minutes, no light, no sound. And Yeah. The first time, I will say, I was like, I can't. One of the things I learned was, I think it worked for me because this was pre ADHD diagnosis. And it was like one of the first times where I was like, oh, I can like shut down my brain because there's no stimuli. It's just nothing. Um, I will say that the time that I write about in the book, I did it in a room size. Like there's one, this is like the size of the room. It's like 9 feet tall and however many, like it was like floating in space.
That's
And
wild.
I lost my mind. It was terrifying because you cannot feel anything. You cannot hear anything. It's just 90 minutes of darkness and it's pitch black. But one of the things that I write about in the book is this idea of the Gonfell effect. And that effect essentially is like almost like tripping on LSD. Like your brain, when you can't see stuff, starts to fill in the neural noise. And so you start seeing images and colors. And like I describe it like feeling like your eyes are closed, but you can't stop seeing. and
That is
it,
so real.
it was terrifying. So the smaller the egg, I'm good for that. I can do that all day long. But the big room, never again. It was terrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a lot. So it was good to see that representation, because what I love about your book is that there are these little moments of like big L loneliness, but these like small moments where loneliness can enter. The one that I was actually stopped at, I was actually so surprised about this, is when you talked about pica.
Oh
So
yes.
I have pica, right? And I had to deal with it in other ways. Like I just always needed to chew ice, and I didn't
Mhm.
know that that was a reaction of my body craving something or desiring and longing something that it didn't have, but I'm just compulsively eating
Yeah.
ice all the time. And so I'm curious if you can talk to us about like the other kind of means of loneliness, these cravings, the longing, these like
Mhm.
phantom urges
Yeah.
that are really carrying the heft of the feelings of loneliness throughout the book.
Yeah. I find that like the small ways that my loneliness show up the most, like the ways that like, because like the like you said, the big lonelies, those are like the real fears of like dying in this apartment alone and not being home before the rest of my family starts to pass away, those big isolation and loneliness feelings. But my loneliness really kind of manifests in small ways every day. So I self-soothe. Like I sleep with a pillow. So depending on what side I'm laying on, I have one that like curves into my back. So it feels like there's somebody there. Or if I'm on my other side, it's like tucked between my legs. So it feels like I'm kind of with somebody because I've been single and alone for so long that I'm very, very touch starved. And I'm very open with telling people that about like somebody can touch me and it feels like I buzz because
Mm,
I don't get kisses because like in your everyday workday, somebody might like there's no real like physical. So my loneliness really shows up physically. Like I tell someone like I just want to hug. It feels like you're starving. It shows up with things like I write in the book about being in the kitchen cooking dinner and just zoning out and being like, it's just me. Somebody at work today asked me, I was ordering lunch. I ordered Five Guys today. And she was like, you could have ordered food. I mean, brought food from home. I was like, I don't really cook by myself too often because I'm not used to cooking for one person. And the act of cooking for one person is still something that just like, I'm just like, wow, I don't have anybody. It's just me.
yeah.
All these like little like creature comforts of life. Or um when I came home from the airport the other day and I came home and I was just like, it's back to the quiet apartment. There's not even a cat to show up and be like, hey, it's me. Welcome back.
No, legit, I feel that way, but I'm like, oh, I have a dog. That's okay. But it's interesting because it's first of all, shout out to your father because I love how you render him in the book.
Uh-huh.
We could talk about this.
Yeah.
I do not have the type of father that you have. Okay.
Mhm.
And so when my dad would come home, he would often, because then we would scatter because my
Mhm.
dad's a tyrant, right? And he would say, like, oh, I should get a dog because then at least the dog will come and see me at the door when I come home. Right. And so there's this sense of like feeling lonely within a family or lonely
Mhm.
within a relationship
Yeah.
that I think interrupts sometimes the fantasy
Mhm.
of connection, especially like romantic connection.
Yeah.
Because you're like, "Ugh, I do would love to like hug somebody right now and like just
Yeah.
kind of cuddle with someone." But then I'm like, but that's like a person and he's probably,
Yeah.
the ROI is probably very low. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I've been married, I've been in long-term relationships, long-term situationships, and I've been lonely, lonely as ever with the person laying next to me, lonely as ever with the ring on my finger. Um, and that's one of the things that I've had to come to terms with is like as touch starved as I am, as so like interested in having a partner that I am, I understand from having hit rock bottom because of being in a very isolated and singular relationship that it's not worth it.
Yeah.
Like I can't, and I know myself well enough, like I can't survive another like heartbreak like that. I just can't. And I'm careful enough with myself now not to put myself in that situation. I used to kind of subscribe to the idea of almost like when you're starving and somebody puts food in front of you, it doesn't matter what it is, you're going to eat it because it's better than not having anything. And for a very long time, I just said, okay, I know there's red flags galore. I know that you are not telling the truth. And I'm smart enough to realize you're not telling the truth, but I'm not by myself. I'm like, and it got to a point where I was like, you can't exist like this anymore. You'll just have to sleep with that body pillow another couple years instead of sacrificing yourself in order not to be alone. Um, but yeah, my dad, as like it's just so funny because people are like, I love your dad and your books. I'm like, because he's great. but I, but I think too, my parents, like I was writing something the other night and I called my dad to ask him about like when did you officially meet my mom and what happened there, this, that, and the other. And I was realizing that it took me a long time to get to the point where I was like, I don't know why I've been ignoring the fact that I have a good example of what being in a relationship is without having to be joined at the hip, but also not feel like you're lonely. Like my mom and dad have been together since 1976.
Mhm.
And my mom has her whole situation. Like she has her friends and her activities, and my dad has his friends and activities, but they've been like
Yeah.
this. And I'm sitting here thinking, oh, I want a little something. Like, why do I have to accept a little something?
Yeah.
Like, it might not be that, but it can't be what the situationships and the scraps, just not to be alone.
Hello.
Yeah, I
Hel-
can't.
and it feels like, oh my gosh, this is another one where I had to stop. I had I couldn't. I was like, can you get out my journal right now, Athena? Like this is too much, right? But this essay, where you talk about this the most is the ruin of rom-coms.
Mhm.
And that, God, like I was confronting with, because recently, I think over the past 2 years, I just kind of like ended my pursuit of romantic relationships. I
Mhm.
remember I met this woman and she's trying to, that's what women like to talk about sometimes, like what's
Mhm.
going on. I was like, oh, I'm not dating. And she goes, oh, are you with somebody? I was like, oh no, I'm just like I'm not dating. And then
Yeah.
she goes, so then like what do you do? And I'm like, literally
Life.
everything else.
Right.
Like and so when I read your chapter, it was forcing me to confront that tension of like my desired
Mhm.
isolation, but also this kind of imposed isolation from
Yeah.
dating because of navigating undesirability and fetishization.
Mhm.
And, you know, I don't know. It was just very confronting for me.
Yeah. I was telling my therapist because, like, in that essay, I talk about how she told me to download the dating apps and it just never works out. And I was telling her a couple weeks ago that I think that I'm starting to have like this shift, right? Where it was like I was very much concentrated on the idea, what is wrong with me, right? I was like, I'm not small enough. I'm getting older. I have like, I'm not the beauty standard of my background or the European standard. I'm like, I'm just here. But I think also I was I was so kind of downtrodden with the idea that I didn't fit what I thought would be desirable or acceptable. I'm older, and the older I get, it's going to be more and more difficult because now I'm really the pool's getting smaller. And then on top of that, like as my dad says, I like to date the potential and not who I should be dating. So my dad is looking at me like, "Hey, you have 3 college degrees. You've written multiple books. What are you doing?" I'm like, "Dad, but I like him." And he's like, "No, you can't. Like, put that
Down.
down." But I told her, I think what's happening now is I'm starting to realize that as much as I've yet to fully wrestle with my desire to be partnered, I am understanding that it's going to take a very special person to deal with me because I've been alone for so long. And it's not even about like, you have to make my life better because I can buy and do whatever I want to do. It's because it's going to take effort to get me to step outside of what I've gotten used to for the last decade plus. We're going to
Yeah.
have to be understanding that my hyper independence is sometimes a crutch. Like, it's very difficult for me to allow people to do things for me because I'm so used to being like, either nobody's doing it for me or they do it and then they hold it over my head. So it's going to take
That
somebody.
part.
Yeah, I'm like, okay, I'll just do it myself. Don't spend the money. Don't show up. I'll do it myself. Don't worry about it. So it's going to take a very special person to show up for me in those ways. And I also have begun to recognize that I may be a little unfair to somebody, because it's
Yeah.
going to take extra effort. Not that I wouldn't give effort back, but it's like holding somebody who's very tender and
Yeah.
not knowing how long it's going to take for that tenderness to go away. But I'm glad that I've moved beyond the point where I was like, there's something fundamentally wrong with me because
Yeah.
why find somebody? I'm like, it's just maybe I'm just going to be the bougie single auntie. I don't know.
Let me
Um,
tell you, Rich Auntie Supreme. I love that. Even though I still joke with my nibblings, and I'm like, listen, I'm trying to find y'all a good uncle. Okay, it's gonna take some time.
right. I'm like the running joke with me and my friend. They're like, look, we know dating apps aren't going to work. We know
Yeah,
I don't
no.
get approached in public. It's going to take one of y'all, somebody you graduated with, a cousin, an uncle, a best friend, a childhood neighbor. One of y'all, if y'all want this to be remedied, one of y'all don't have to help me.
Do the work.
Please.
It takes a village.
A city at this point.
City. It takes a whole city. It takes a hemisphere.
It does.
What I loved about that essay, you talk about like moving beyond this manufactured romance that we
Mhm.
get with the images from pop culture, and you referenced the movie He's Just Not That Into You, that film.
Mhm. Yeah.
There's this paragraph that followed. If it's okay, you can say no. I would like to read it
Oh,
if
yeah.
people want to get a feel for it. But so you're talking about like after you're mentioning this film, and you write, I think we're supposed to follow the logic that there is always bitter before the sweet. And if you can just swallow the first mouthfuls of it, then all will be well. This is bullshit. It is bullshit because swallowing and swallowing and swallowing the bitter makes you immune to the harm. And before you know it, you are happy to think this is how you are to be fed. With every rom com, romance novel, and love song I've ingested, I've learned to ignore the poison for the sake of the cure. And I'm like, damn, Athena. Damn. If I had this 10 years ago, you would have saved me a lot of
I would have
heartache.
saved myself a couple of years in recent times.
What was it like to render this on the page? Because it was so confronting for me to read. I could not imagine writing that down.
I think therapy helps. Um, Shout out to Sierra, my therapist. But
Shout
and
out.
actually having a black woman as a therapist, because it's the first time I've ever had a black woman as a therapist, and it's a marked difference than having other therapists in the past. Like I say at the very beginning of the essay, like I don't have to explain to her when I say I feel like Terry from Soul Food. She knows exactly what I'm talking about. So it opened up a space where I felt like I could start to explore these things. Um, Writing it was kind of like almost like I don't want to say journaling, but almost like opening up at like a notebook and writing a letter to myself, because if for the first time I really kind of had to examine why I felt the way that I felt and really examine how it manifests in my life. Like I had never really thought before I wrote that essay about how I zone out, and how small things like the laundry like bothers me, and what it's like to feel like a fetish, like what it's like to in some ways almost consider like, can I just take this for a minute, and not being willing to do it. So it was almost like writing a letter to myself. It was one of the first times I really allowed myself to be honest. Because I like that's like I said a minute ago, I used to hide behind the idea there's something wrong with me. There was
Yeah.
another phase of that was like, oh, God and the universe are just creating this perfect situation for me, and it's just not time yet. And I'm like, no, it's just maybe it's just not meant to be. So it was like it was me shaking myself out of like this really detrimental notion that there was something wrong with me, but also this very delusional there's going to be this magical love affair for me in the future. And like getting down to honest, like, no, neither one of those is true. Like, what's the medium of that? Like, you theoretically, scientifically, are a Black woman on a dating app. They're not checking for you. Like, they're not. There's nothing, there's no picture, there's no profile, there's nothing that you could
Yeah.
do that make you more desirable in those situations because that's just how the app works. And but also, you're never going to have a rom-com. They don't exist. And if they did exist, they're not existing for you because scientifically, you're still a Black woman in this society. So, like, where do you go after you dissect this? And that's kind of, it was like just like the first time I really had to dissect some of the things that I was allowing myself to believe.
Yeah. That's so real. I think so. I had a Black woman therapist for, I think, 1.5 years, 2 years. And at one point I was complaining about my dad and I was like, my father's a tyrant or something like that. And then she goes, your father's a tyrant and so are you. And I was like, oh,
Hold on.
I was like, oh, see, this is why I actually don't want a Black woman therapist, because I can't hide behind having to explain. And then she went straight at it. And I'm like,
yeah.
And that's what I feel like your book does, where it's just like, oh, how do you feel about this? Like, are you actually going to be okay with being fetishized? Like, do you understand? Like, do you think you're undesirable, or is this undesirability thing happening to you? And I was like, okay, I really have to start kind of detangling these images of what my life would be and what's actually happening and what I'm doing to myself. Like, this doesn't have to hurt me.
Yeah.
It can just exist. And I feel like you have such a kind of, you're just so non-judgmental, I think, about loneliness, to just look at it of like, what is this? Versus, I don't know, like, it doesn't feel mean when you're talking about loneliness.
I think too, I was like, I know that a lot of the talk that happens with Black women in particular is like, you don't want to be like the strong Black woman and it's detrimental to us, which it very much is. But I think too, we don't get space to be in our quieter emotions. Like it's either like this super strong Black woman or there's just nothing. Like there's no, like sometimes, like I've never felt like I've always had to, I think it's just innate to us, sadly, but I've never had to think about like, I am a strong Black woman, because it's just like, Athena, get up and go to work. Athena, get up and go to class, do whatever, pay for this, do that. I'm like, it's just a thing. I never thought about it. I was always more concerned about like the quieter things that I felt like didn't get the attention. So like the book that I'm writing now, I'm writing about what it's like to kind of have the name of a deity and not feel like I'm living up to it, have never lived up to it, and how I'm trying to grow into this name. But part of that is me writing deeply for the first time into the louder feelings of my life. And I think that the Loneliness Files was like kind of like my try at saying it's okay to exist in a softness. It's not related to and I'll clean this up. Not related to self-care, not related to love, not related to romance. Like there are softer feelings that we feel that can be just as heavy and traumatic and detrimental to us. That
Yeah.
women don't get to say, I'm lonely, because you're a caretaker, you're a boss, you're an educator, you're everything to everybody. And
Mm.
so when you say I'm lonely, the first thing is going to be how? You're never by yourself. How? You're never not busy. How are you lonely? Or you just need self-care. I'm like, no, like I can't pedicure my way out of any of this. Like
Mm-hmm.
I can't like vacation. I'm like, my vacations consist of me sleeping. Like because I,
Mm-hmm.
like, so I wanted to be able to write into these softer things. And one of the primary things that I write, that I think about when I write, whether it be this first book or this book or even the one that I'm writing now, is I want to be able to give space for people who feel like their voices and their experiences aren't loud enough to be important. That
Mm.
sometimes, especially in the memoir and personal essay space, we are so expected to be loud and salacious and bombastic, and we have to confront all the social issues, and we have to, and all that stuff is very valid. And I'm reading some amazing stuff right now, but I want there to be space for people who feel like I'm just really, really lonely today. And it's not
Yeah.
because I'm hiding from something traumatic. Like I'm sad today because I took the laundry out of the thing and they're all my clothes. Or I came home from the airport and there's nobody waiting to pick me up and give me a hug. Or I'm lonely today because I'm still trying to figure out who I am. And so I
Yeah.
want to leave space for that. And I think that there is no room for judgment or resolution there. It's just like, here are the things that you need to think about. This is how it manifests for me. How does it show up for you?
Yeah. There are like three questions that I have based on that. And so I'm
Mhm.
trying to hold it all in my head. The first thing, just based on what you just said, that comes to mind is the essay that is just tidbits of your journal entry
Mhm.
from, I think the earliest year is 2011.
Mhm.
And just to see these threads of these quiet moments, like we don't know the full entry. We just get like a sentence, maybe two, a couple more. But to see that kind of that thread of loneliness, but also I was impressed and inspired really to speak to myself more honestly in my own journaling
Mhm.
and to give myself between me and my private pages of like, what are those quiet fears, emotions, observations that I can give myself that space? Because I
Mhm.
feel like, to your point, especially being who we are, we don't often have that space out in the world.
Yeah. I wanted to include that particular like series of essay or journal little lines because I didn't want, especially because I wrote the book between the COVID times, that I didn't want people to think it was a COVID book. I didn't want them to think that it was just me saying, oh, I'm lonely and sad or isolated because of COVID and I can't go anywhere. Like, no, I want you to see that this is an ongoing thing, that it's been with me for a decade plus. It's been with me since I was a child. I'm like, so I'm going to show you, because I think I journaled every day from November or whenever time in 2011 up until like 2017, every single day. Sometimes it was just a line, sometimes it was multiple pages, but I made it a point every single day to write something down. And so I was like, I'm going to go through, and I read every one of those journals, and it took me on a ride because I had forgotten how low I had gotten at some points and how just like I'm in some ways careless I was with myself because I was allowing myself to
Mm,
go deeply into it. But I wanted people to be able to see this is not something new. It's not something to be ashamed of. Like clearly I've had a life that existed over these 10 years and there's joy. Like some of those little lines are like, I'm sitting in it. What is that? I'm having dinner and I'm exercising demons over dinner and I'm
yeah.
oddly kind. Like, yeah, I remember exactly where I was. I was at a diner in New Jersey.
Yeah.
But like so, like there is all this loneliness, but there's also joy, and there's also me recognizing that loneliness is not holding me down. So that's why that's there. I really wanted it to be a way for people to see that it's not a singular time frame of my life
Yeah.
that I carry with me every single day.
Yeah, reading your book, I had a really different COVID experience, like lockdown experience, because the pandemic started like a year and a half after I got discharged from the hospital.
Mhm.
And I was on 4 months of disability leave. And I was like so lonely and isolated, both like in the world, but also feeling isolated from my own body because I couldn't recognize myself after the surgery. And so I think the invitation for you, like you tracking your own loneliness and just like the poetry of your book, it's not a pandemic book because it touches on so many different elements of loneliness, and I'm connecting it to things that were happening well before
Mhm.
the pandemic, you know. I'm curious because there's a section later in the book where you talk about you were given your grandmother's journal.
Mhm.
And there's this line that you have in talking about it where you say that nothing in this journal makes me think the reality on the pages is curated.
Yeah.
And that made me start thinking about like when someone reads my journals when I pass, will they get the sense of its curation? Or do you
Mhm.
feel like you've changed your style of your personal writing through that lens?
Um, I will say that I've not journaled in a minute, in the way that I was journaling before. Um, I'll say this and then answer the question. I'm not journaling in the way that I was before because at the time that I was journaling for like that 6 years straight, I was journaling very specifically to have a voice that I didn't have. I started the journal that I started in 2011 was started the literal night that my ex-husband told me he was cheating on me and I left him. Because I had no way to like, I was like, I'm going to hurt somebody or
Is
myself.
journal or murder? Okay,
I'm like,
journaling or
something's gonna happen.
murder.
So I went, and when I came back to my senses across the bridge at my coworker's house, I had opened my laptop and I wrote. And it's still some of the
Mm,
most painful stuff. I read it back and I was like, oh my, I don't know how I'm here. Like it was so painful and so raw. And so I was writing very specifically to get all of just the bile and anger and fear and uncertainty of that time frame out of my life. And so now the journaling that I do, and I'm struggling with this because it's much more aimed towards what I want to write. And
mm,
I'm finding it more difficult to journal now because now I'm seeing the curation. So now I'm keeping this journal that I've been keeping since November, I think, um, documenting the little luxuries of my life. So every night I write down a song that was luxurious for me that day, a book that I'm reading, and something that I did in my body that felt like luxury. And I started it because I wanted to track that and write it, but there's no real life stuff in those journals. And so now I see the curation, and I would be honestly a little bit embarrassed and ashamed if anybody ever found those journals because they would be like, you're clearly mining your life for writing. And it's why I'm having
mm.
a difficult time keeping up with it because there's no personal exploration in,
Yeah.
in those journals now. Like my grandmother's journal, which is on the bookshelf in my bedroom in the little spot with the little mini altar, is it really is like I write in the book. It's like one entry is really just what she ate for breakfast, and then the next entry is about the time one of my uncles went to jail. And then the next one is like her having this recurring dream of my grandfather that shows up over the course of the journal over and over again, and how
Mm,
like and she's had this dream, and none of it feels like she was trying to manipulate anything. And I'm still curious about why she like handed it over. We would have found it eventually, but it was like she
oh,
purposely
she handed it.
yeah,
Wow.
on the front cover in red ink, please read. Um, so she wanted it to be seen. So I think now having possession of it and seeing how I've strayed from journaling my life, I need to get back to the original journaling because I'm really off the path at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of this part in your book too, as we think about the stuff that we leave behind. You
Mhm.
made a comment that someone said that, well, what I took away from it, it's like creating a life that would make the estate sale cool,
Yeah.
you know? And it just reminded me, I have this, I guess, you know, if my nieces and nephews see this, you know, after I've passed, just to let y'all know, like I have about 500 books in my apartment. And anytime I get like someone sends me a card or an invitation for something, or even like the speaker badges for like an event that I do, I tuck them in all the books. And so sometimes, because a lot of these books I haven't read, I'll pick up a book and it's like a little surprise for myself, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, ooh, I'm just tucking away these little surprises for my nieces and nephews. Then when I saw my niece the other day in DC, there's a store that's called My Dead Aunt's Bookstore. And I'm like,
oh. Did you go in?
This is what I did go in, and I'm like, it's a really old, like, kind of store. And I'm like, wait, I really do think that these are your dead aunt's books.
Yes. Like, probably. That's why I keep my good things jar and my intentions jar, because I'm like, somebody's gonna, it might be a little bit hoarderish, but yeah. Just a tiny bit. I tend to use like, I'll open my books and there'll be like random boarding passes and postcards and receipts, and then it like takes me on this whole like journey. I'm like, where was I without? First of all, I'm embarrassed I haven't picked this book up since the last time I boarded this plane, which was however long ago. Not that the book's not good. The brain scattered. So yeah, like I joke. My sister hates when I joke about it, but I'm like, you know, when I pass away, since I'm the kids and I don't have it, you're gonna be like, I'm gonna try to get rid of some of this stuff, but I got some cool stuff. So you might want to have a cool. I think I'll have a pretty cool estate sale. Like I got some cool stuff.
I've listened, heard you talk about some of the stuff that you have, like even the intentions jar, and I was like, damn, you're so intentional about your life. I'm like, I feel like Athena's estate sale is gonna be cooler than mine.
I think the reason why I am is because I've been in Philadelphia 9 years this past week. This is the longest I've ever lived anywhere. My limit is usually 4 years and then I'm somewhere else. But also I've had more than once my entire life ripped out from under me and being like stuff in storage and scattered across multiple states. I was like, when I settle, I'm settling. This is my space. This is what I like. I'm going to have the art that I want. I'm going to have the books that I want. One of my friends told me a part of my apartment looks like a racism museum. Because I have a lot of my Black Americana, which I started buying out of spite because I saw a white man selling one of the water fountain signs, and I was like, nope, you're not selling this to anybody else. So I'm gonna spend my last $30. I was a broke college student. I was like, you're not. That's how the collection started. Because I was like, spite was like, absolutely not. So yeah, like part of it is really moving here and creating a space that was my own, but also having the power to say, this is my space. Not only do I pay the bills, I'm decorating it the way that I want. I've had like, one of the things I like to do, or haven't done in a while, I used to like to reupholster furniture. I like thrifting. I like repurposing things. And I had a partner who, when we were going through the breakup, made this point of like, essentially how much he hated it. It was trash and this, that, and the other. And I was like, no, there's never a time that anybody in life is ever going to like downplay what I like, my interests, what I find attractive and design. If I want to reupholster this chair in the ugliest fabric ever, it's the fact that I can do that and you can't. So yeah, it's very intentional because I want my space to be my space. I want it to be safe. I want it to be comfortable. And I don't want anybody to have any onus on any of it.
Yeah, no, that's so real. Which one's your favorite essay to read from? Or maybe your favorite, the one that you liked writing the most, however you want to answer that.
Let me look. I would say that the reason I have to look is because there are certain essays that I really like that I've never read aloud because I didn't write them with the intention of reading them aloud. So something like I Was in Love with Jake Sisko, I've never read out loud, but I enjoyed writing it. I think probably my favorite one to read, and this is going to sound really bad, is the last essay, Auld Lang Syne, because I do enjoy a little bit of emotional manipulation with my readers, and I've made people cry multiple times reading it.
Yes.
Yeah. So like, yeah, I like to see. I like the gay. Oh, and the one that's the most fun to read is the Rune of Rom-Coms,
Yes.
because I don't try to be funny when I write, but people find that one hilarious. Even though I'm like, no, I'm very sad. I don't have a boyfriend, but they find it hilarious. So
Like,
yeah,
why is that funny to you? Why is that funny to you?
why? Like, I know Troy threw the oranges, but still, it's not funny. It's very tragic. But those are my favorite two to read, just because I get the most audience reaction. And I also like the opening and the closing of In Service of the Algorithm, because I love the Truman Show deeply.
Yes,
Yeah.
I loved that one. I will say, first of all, I loved every freaking essay, and that's not normal for me. Like, you have highs and lows, but
Yeah.
I think because I read through it twice, I was getting so much from it.
Mhm.
I think upon my second read, and you were talking about this earlier, but like, you have the right to remain silent.
Yeah.
It's a shorter piece. It is of salacious material, right?
Yeah.
You're a Black woman having a traffic stop, a traumatic police interaction.
Mhm.
But on a craft level,
Mhm.
my God, Athena. Athena.
I'm a little nerdy sometimes.
Okay, so if people haven't read it, right? This thing is playing out the way they all play out, right? And you're so insular. You're talking about a police interaction, traffic stop, but through the lens of language and linguistics. It is so internal. And I've had my own police interactions,
Mhm.
and thinking through that experience through, it's not about what was said and what was done. It's like, what's happening?
Mhm.
If I don't know if there's anything that you want to share a bit about the crafting of that piece. It's
Mhm.
so nerdy. It's so good. I have some questions, but if you just want to
Yeah.
talk about it, like, that would be great.
So my MFA is in creative writing, and poetry. And so my research thesis was on phonetic intensives and linguistics, and how you use those as the building blocks of poetry, literally how you form the language in your body, and then the word choice on top of that can drastically change whatever you're trying to convey to your audience. And so when I was thinking of that particular day, I was like, I can remember all the sounds of that day. But what really struck with me was like, I don't remember saying anything. I don't remember responding. And I was like, so I can't approach this piece as the physical. Like, I could tell you that the hood was warm. I could tell you that it was raining. I could tell you what time of year. I'm like, the physical body didn't matter. It was the fact that in that moment, with all the chaos going on around me, with these guns pointed at us, with me being searched, me being a bank robber, I don't remember a single word that I said. And I was like, I forgot how to talk. Like, that's the only thing I could think. So I was like, how do I go back to like the actual beginnings of language? And that's where all the linguistics came in, because I was like, I don't even remember after we were done and getting in the car, if me and her had a conversation. Like, all of language disappeared from that day. So I was like, I have to find a way to give myself the language back. And so I already had research and information about linguistics and phonetic intensives. I was like, so I'll use that to give myself the language back. And that's kind of how the essay came to be.
Athena Dixon. The first time I read that chapter, that essay, I didn't really understand what was happening on a craft level, because I'm going through my own memories and stuff, and then to revisit it, and like, I'll probably revisit it a bunch of more times, because I find it so compelling of how do you write about a thing kind of tangentially to the main action of what's happening in the essay. I just thought it was like I just thought it was really well done.
Thank
I
you.
loved it. So I appreciate that. And I know it's like a difficult topic. Last question.
Mhm.
We're both wearing our hometown shirts, which was
No,
not planned.
not hometown, but home
Not
state.
hometown, home state, home state.
Home
That's what I
state.
meant. Home
Yeah.
state, home state, home state. Sorry, Alliance. Home state.
Alliance is like, look, I don't know if we're gonna have an Alliance Ohio T-shirt, so close enough.
Close enough, close enough. Um, upon my return,
Mhm.
it's when on the back half of it. Also, this is nerdy of me. I don't know. So obviously, for people who've been listening to this conversation, we say lonely and loneliness a lot, and
Mhm.
it's written a lot in the book.
Yeah.
Even though every time I encounter it, it feels fresh because it's so intentionally placed. But I did realize that in that last section of the book, it's almost, I think it's only there once or twice. Like the actual word
Yeah.
lonely and loneliness doesn't act, it's not really there.
Mhm.
And I thought that was so, I don't know if it was intentional, but I noticed it and it kind of fit with the theme of like coming back home.
Mhm. That was not intentional,
Okay.
but I did want to kind of like lean into a sense of reconnecting, but no, it was not intentional to only use it that couple of times. But the idea of reconnecting was very much intentional.
No, I really appreciate it. And so I'm curious, like, we're both, I think you've been away from your hometown around the same time I've been out here in Seattle. I've been in Seattle like 9.5 years.
Yeah.
What do you make of this question that is circling the book of, do I go home?
Mhm.
Is that what needs to happen? Kind of dealing with this kind of relocation and migration and
Mhm.
the making of self to the
Yeah.
places that you are.
Yeah. I do write in that essay a line along the paraphrasing the line about I no longer worry about the fear of not leaving. I worry about the fear of not returning. And that's still something that I'm struggling with is that I know that it was I'm a firm believer in the idea that the good and the bad, every single thing along a path leads you to where you're supposed to be. And any deviation off that path is going to change where you're fundamentally meant to end up. And so for all the pain and the heartache and the isolation and the loneliness, I have allowed myself comfort in knowing that it led me to where I am right now. That had I not gone through the divorce, I would have never written a personal essay because that was the only reason I started writing essays. Had COVID, again, nobody wants COVID, but had COVID not happened and I had to sit in this apartment for 2 years, I would have never written this book. So I believe all these things led to that point. And the thing that I'm struggling with now in terms of returning home is that there's a part of me that's like, you want to return home for both fear and nostalgia and love. And depending on the day, those things are out of balance. And sometimes they are in balance. Like right now, I want to go home out of love. A couple months ago was out of fear because like I don't want anything to happen to my family and I'm out there. And then other days it's nostalgia because I'll see all my cousins and people from high school hanging out and doing stuff. And I'm like, I'm in this apartment. And so I'm struggling with whether or not the love outweighs the fear and the nostalgia, and whether or not I can find a happy medium. Because Philadelphia, in some ways, I feel like has run its course, but I also love being in a city. I also love being able to go to Baltimore really easy. I love Baltimore. If I don't live in home or in Philadelphia, I'll probably live in Baltimore. But I like the convenience and the social life and the creative life that I have here, but it's so isolating from the people that I really, really love. And so I'm like, my biggest struggle is trying to find a solution. And the solution has not presented itself yet. But I also am lucky enough to have people on the other end of that, like my mom and my dad and my sister was like, we understand your desire to come home, but you can't sacrifice what's best for you in order to do that. We're not requesting that of you. If you come back, you're welcome back with open arms in whatever capacity or however long you come back, but don't use that as your basis. And I have not gotten my mind around that yet about whether or not the fear, the love, and the nostalgia are in enough balance where I can make a decision.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you for even going through that, because it's given me a lot to think about too. I've been struggling with whether to go back to New York, and also facing the realities that I'm not the same person who could be back in the city like that for a lot of different reasons. And being a New Yorker is such a big part of my identity, and facing the realities that I'm obviously not the same person who left, right?
Yeah.
And so do I even fit back into that place? But
that's what my therapist said. She's like, she understands the nostalgia for wanting to go home and the desire for wanting to go home, but also to realize that if I go back, I'm going back not only to a world that doesn't exist anymore because I haven't been there in almost a decade, but also all of the lives of the people still there have 10 years of connection that I don't have. And that just because what was 10 years ago is something that I miss and love doesn't mean that that's still going to exist. And I have to consider what happens if I go back and that world is so fundamentally changed that it's not what I've been kind of like longing for. And I haven't been able to answer that yet.
Yeah.
And it's a different kind of lonely when you go back, because now you're 10 years in the past and you're by yourself. So
like a kind of a loneliness or isolation from who you think you are now, that I think going back forces you to reckon with. Yeah. Thank you so much for this conversation, Athena.
Thank you for having me and for listening to me ramble about all manner of love and touch starvation and float tanks and whatever.
No, that is the gift of your book, though. Like, I find it so meditative, and there's so many ways to enter in. Like, I honestly, I have like 15 more questions. That is just like, we're just going to talk about that later.
Text me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. Thank you to oneKIN. Please get the Loneliness Files. It's a goodie. It's a goodie. Bye.